Oh, cool. Good morning, everyone. I'll go ahead and get started. It's interesting. A long time ago now, oh shoot, what year was it? Back in 2016, I was speaking at Devops Days Amsterdam. And in preparation for that presentation, I created this presentation and I ran it by a colleague of mine to get their feedback. And well, he gave me feedback that I already had in my head. I had a presentation with DevSecOps in the title. And this was 2016, and it was pretty buzzword heavy, pretty new. And I wasn't sure how I felt about using it. And when he shared that feedback, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to use DevSecOps in the title. So I ended up giving a presentation at Devops Days Amsterdam about, and I titled it, DevOps has always been about security. So fast forward about 6 years, you now see my first presentation with DevSecOps in the title. However, had I done it about 6 years ago, I would have been among the first few folks talking about the subject of DevSecOps. So I'm going to dedicate this presentation to Michael Ducey and his, well, feedback that could have been a little different, but I think it worked out for us all in the end. So hi, my name is Warner Moore. My background's cybersecurity and technology. And I've spent my career working with technology organizations, so organizations where tech is their business and product across industries. So here in Columbus, that's been a lot of different companies across different technology categories like fintech, insurtech, healthcare IT. And in many of those organizations, I built the security and/or privacy programs. So scaled those companies, built the teams, built the security programs. I even helped build a unicorn, a startup that ended up selling for over $1 billion, cover my meds. So I've been doing this for a while now. And over time, we've called it different things, DevOps, DevSecOps, web operations. But ultimately, I think a lot of the philosophy is the same. We've just evolved the words we use to describe it over time. Now I'm pretty focused on my company, GammaForce. And what we do at GammaForce is we help companies with technology and cybersecurity strategy. And we do that through fractional executive services and expert strike teams. So I'm serving as CISO of many companies right now. And now I quit counting around 6 or 7. I built many security programs now. And I'm super passionate about community. I founded a nonprofit called Tech Community Coalition, a 501c3. We just turned 6. And I do a lot in the community through different organizations such as LAPSA, OLF Conference, and Toastmasters. So today, we have a really long speaking slot. This, I want to say, is an hour and 15 minutes. Typically, I present for about 30 to 45 minutes, throw some questions and answers on the end. So I suspect we'll end early, but I also want to allow the opportunity to have a dialogue. And we can save to the end, or if you have thoughts along the way, feel free to jump in too. I have thick skin, you're not going to offend me. Unless you throw things, and then I might not like that as much. But really these days, it's less about throwing things. It's more like coughing within 100 feet. I've actually been giving presentations over the past couple years, but primarily virtually. I think this is maybe only the second presentation I've given in person over the past couple years. So super glad to be here. Big hand for the Path to Agility team. They put a lot of work into this, and it's even more work because we're restarting our community machine, right? Path to Agility hasn't happened in a couple years. And I'm super glad it's back. It's one of my favorite conferences here in Columbus. It represents the intersection of technology leadership very well. So thank you for having me. Like I mentioned before, we're going to talk primarily about DevOps culture and practices, but also explore the intersection of security and how those things really complement each other. In security, I think we have some bad habits around doing things because they say they're supposed to be done that way. Right? It's kind of a cliche in tech, in careers, to do the things we've always been doing just because. And unfortunately, I think that culture is still prevalent in security. And it's a really challenging landscape out there, right? We have all these folks on the internet, countries that aren't always friendly, organized crime out there trying to get us. But the thing is, if we use modern practices, I believe we can be more secure than we've ever been. And I'm also going to be exploring the concept of penetration testing and how we might approach it differently using DevOps culture and practices through purple team exercises. So why do we do this cybersecurity thing? Some ideas, thoughts from the audience?
Keep us secure.
Yeah. So protect our assets.
Yeah, stay in business, protect our assets. Any other thoughts?
Keep us out of the news.
Keep us out of the news. There is such thing as bad press, I think, in some cases, that's for sure. Any other ideas?
Yeah, keep our system out of jail.
Yeah, stay out of jail, that's for sure. It's interesting, there's CISOs out there that have had conflicts with the strategy of their organizations, and some of them very publicly. I'm not going to name anyone because I think it's a little rude, but credit to their character, I know they left the organization responsibly as an executive. They didn't table flip and walk out the door, but they didn't agree with the organization's approach, philosophy towards security, and they left the company. So all your ideas are spot on. We're doing this cybersecurity thing to keep our assets and our data safe. If you think of the risk formula, we throw words like risk around a lot in different fields, and I think fundamentally we usually mean the same thing. There is a definition of risk, and it's an asset. You have to have something of value that has a threat, meaning somebody trying to take it, or many versions of that, with a vulnerability. I often use the example of, well, my wallet doesn't necessarily have a huge vulnerability in my pocket, but we're in a public space, and no one in this room, of course, but folks outside of this room could potentially be a threat. And, well, that's a vulnerability, just putting it on the table. So if you leave your laptop in public, that's a vulnerability. So those, well, your laptop having value, those three things together create risk. And we often throw around risk without having those three things together. So I think it's a really good thing to think about. So when we're talking about keeping our assets and our data safe, well, our data is an asset, and it's kind of the same thing. So we're keeping it safe, and we're also trying to keep it safe from scary people, right? We don't want this asshole to steal our stuff. It does get cold. It's pretty warm right now. So the fundamentals behind security aren't super complicated. So what do? We're trying to keep that asshole from stealing our stuff. We build a security program. And in security, the concept of a blue team is a team focused on creating defensive security capabilities. So we get this team together, and this team builds and implements and is responsible for all this stuff. SIM, FIM, NIDS, HIDS, IPS, IDS. Now we have all these new things too that all these vendors will sell us. I didn't see any here, but there's a lot out there, and boy, will they sell it to you. Things like CASB, CSPM. Are there any other security tools that you've commonly encountered? What did I miss?
For blue team?
Yeah, just defensive tools, defensive security tools.
Different scanning tools, right? Like a DAS tool, an IAS tool.
Yeah, dynamic application security testing. Yeah, very cool. I missed that. Good call. Who can tell me what CSPM is? I have a cheat sheet here. I'm not sure I'd be able to tell you.
Cloud security protection, I'm guessing.
Monitoring.
Very close. Anyone else?
Google says.
I think the first time I saw it, well, the first time I saw it, a sales guy was trying to sell it to me. And then I saw it on a Gartner report, and I'm like, oh, okay, these marketing people must know each other. And we keep on creating these new things, but it's cloud security posture management. And it's not really all that fancy. There's nothing special about it. All these are the same things with different veneers on them. So we've got our blue team. We have our CSPM, our DLP, all the things. And some of them even work. Probably only one or two of them, because that's a lot of stuff, and security is underfunded and difficult to hire for, so we don't have enough folks on our blue team. And then we have all these people out there that say we have to do even more things. Our customers, our industry, our regulators. So we do more. We work on meeting all these compliance requirements. We check the box, we implement the controls, but that's not enough. They say we need a third-party assessment because they don't trust us. We need a penetration test too. And it's going to hold us accountable. If our security program is robust and our team is big enough, we might even do it on our own. So we built a red team because we're extra fancy. Or we hire a firm because it's expensive and good luck hiring those folks. We bring in a firm, bring in a red team to do offensive security testing, a penetration test. Who here has bought a penetration test before? Few of us, that's cool. More than I expected, honestly, in this audience. Oh, cool. So we have one penetration test in the audience, but 3 folks who know about it. So what did you get from that penetration test?
Lots of headache.
A lot of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, a lot of vulnerabilities. And that's exactly right. I bought my first penetration test in 2004. I had to dig pretty deep to figure that out. And before that, I just did it myself, right? Because I like doing that work, and as in technical roles at the time, is my stuff broken? Are there common vulnerabilities out there? And since then, I've gone out of my way to only work with the best people when it came to doing penetration testing. I chose the firms I hired based on the people who work there. Because there are a ton of firms out there that will sell you a pen test, but once the person does it, they may or may not just be running a vulnerability scan. And well, shoot, we can all do that. Well, we can talk about that later. And we choose what type of test. We might do black box, where the testers don't know anything about our environment. Or we do white box, where they know as much as we can tell them practically. Most of us do gray box, where they know a little bit. We give them a clue, because it's expensive, and if we don't give them a clue, it'll cost us more, or the results won't be as effective. And what do we get? We get a bunch of vulnerabilities, exactly what you said. Tactical, low-value results. Sure, it's more than a vulnerability scan if you're hiring a good firm. And like I said, I go out of my way to hire the best folks. The reality is, it's a time-boxed exercise. 40 hours on the high end, usually anywhere between 20 and 80 hours. Many of you know how technical things work. And you're trying to compromise and move through every layer of the tech stack. That takes a lot of time to do effectively. And shoot, we have nation states, organized criminals all around the world where it's their full-time job. They're not time box. So really, we're just getting this big report. We're checking the compliance box. Then we churn a bunch of time remediating things we don't care about because it's on a report, low risk. Now, on the report, it might say high risk, but like we talked about before, well, it's not really looking at it from the perspective of a risk formula. It might say it is in the report, but what about in the context of our organization? Is it a high-value asset with a vulnerability and an actual threat? Maybe it's buried in an internal network that so few people have access to. Sure, it might be an asset, but the threat is really low. Now, it might have a vulnerability. And if we're more mature than most organizations, we have an impressive budget. We build the teams, so our team's actively working on it in our organization. We're going to get better results, but it's still that tactical attack view. So we went through all that effort. We built a team with an above average security program. Our blue team's on point, our stuff is locked down, and we're paying attention to it. A thing I like to say is we know what we have and we pay attention to it. That's a really important thing with security. If you're not doing that, all the other tools don't matter. It's compliant, PCI, HIPAA, high trust, CMMC, ISO 27001, NIST. We're doing all the things, it's compliant. Our audits and assessments pass, not much red ink in them. Even better, we built a red team, and it's a good one. We paid a lot for it. Yet the folks we're working with are still doing dumb things. They're clicking on links. So we've had enough. We lock it all down. No one can access their email anymore, much less click links. We're telling them no. Our coworkers can't do their jobs anymore. But it isn't working. We're pushing that boulder uphill. We're spending time and money on things that are low value, but checking boxes, we're super compliant. And we're slowing down our organizations and disappointing our coworkers, and in extreme cases, disappointing our customers in the marketplace. That's a challenge I see a lot when I'm working with partners, clients, different people in the industry, where they have some security organization outside of them that is telling them no. So it's affecting how other organizations work. And something we forget about sometimes is our organizations, some of us work at nonprofits, but most of our organizations are offering a service, a business. So if we're doing something to reduce the efficacy of the thing our companies are built to do, well, might rethink that a little bit. And in the worst cases, we're still getting breached because our stuff's complicated and we might not be managing risk. So how do we fix that? Any ideas? Just give up? Well, Purple Team is part of it. I'd say using DevOps culture and practices and Purple Team exercises can be a side effect of that. This is how I've been helping companies build and scale for a long time. And I really liked DevOps culture and practices. When we founded DevOps Days Columbus here back about 7 years ago, it wasn't that the things we were talking about were new. It was just a shared language where we had general interest in it. So it gave us a platform to popularize the concepts and things that leading tech organizations have been doing, which is fantastic, because we should be doing these things. However, if our company, if we're a modern tech organization, where technology is our business and product, we have an above average engineering team. We have to. It's what we do. So it's more practical and reasonable and frankly easy to implement modern technology practices. And how I really think of it too is cross-functional teams with shared purpose. If you have a DevOps team in your organization with a bunch of DevOps engineers in it, that's an anti-pattern. Maybe they're doing cool work, maybe not, but that's not DevOps. Cross-functional teams with shared purpose. And I often encourage, and this is difficult because it's expensive, there's not enough folks out there. At least in some of the teams, I encourage having security practitioners be in the cross-functional teams. So if we're building a tech team, right, in a cross-functional tech team at that, it might be around a product. Then we're going to have a systems engineer in it. We're going to have a software engineer, maybe a test engineer, maybe some product or process folks to represent the non-technical aspects of what we're doing. That's a pretty solid cross-functional team right there. But many organizations stop there. They don't even think about including security. I'd say that we all know it's very difficult to hire security folks, but maybe you have a mid to senior level software engineer in the team who's more passionate about security. Well, send them to OWASP Columbus meetings, support them in their journey, and they can be responsible for it. Because in cross-functional teams, it's less about the title and more about just the professional experience and background, having the experience to be able to represent it. And in this case, having the engineer who can represent security in the context of the work being done in the team. If we don't develop talent in tech and cybersecurity, we'll never catch up. Sorry, university, that's so kind to host us. It's going to take at least 20 years. We have to help. And for security folks in the room, we really need to embrace working this way. It's not natural in some security organizations where we're siloed and barking orders from an ivory tower. But if we truly want to secure our organizations, being part of the teams who are building things is one of the good ways to do it. So we've been talking about DevOps culture and practices generally. Coming back to security, having that security person be responsible for DevSecOps, and really that's just a fancy word for automating security in the SDLC, or how we build software or technology. Make sure that security automation is in the products we're building. And consider it from a product feature perspective too. This is something that many leading product organizations aren't even doing. We have security risk in our organizations. All of us individually have security risk every day. And if the tools we're using don't help us make decisions that help protect our accounts and our assets better, well, we're not going to win. So in those organizations, it's just as important to represent product features from a security perspective as well. It might be simple. It might just be supporting multi-factor authentication or building workflows where it's easier for people to do their jobs more securely when they're interacting with customers. Instead of just showing every screen, maybe having a code that only the customer knows that they have to share before the admin screen that the support person in the organization is working in. Just thinking about it not only from a technical perspective, but a product perspective. And we've talked a lot about it, but I'll just emphasize again, embedding security in your organization. If you're not talking about security up front before you start building things and thinking about it while you're building things, well, you're not going to be building secure products. So moving back to the point you made earlier, sir, well, purple team exercises are a version of that. We talked a lot about tactical penetration tests and how we're tired of these reports, right? Another symptom of these reports, for many of us who are business-to-business companies, we have to share that report with our clients as part of their vendor management programs. And then our client is asking us why we have high-risk vulnerabilities and when we're going to fix them, even though they're probably low risk in our organization. So we don't only create noise internally in our companies, we create noise and pressure outside of our companies. Penetration tests do have their place. I think of it as an accountability mechanism in a mature security program. So if I built a really secure and mature program, well, we're humans. We all make mistakes. So maybe we accidentally left a firewall role open on the internet to a thing we probably shouldn't. Hopefully not a database, but maybe we did that. Well, that external network penetration test is going to find it. That's what I really look at those for. But that's not really all that fancy, right? There are a lot of things we can do before that's high on my list of things I'm worried about. Because if we have databases on the internet, we probably know about it internally, and we don't need a report to tell us that. So let's skip this step and just fix it. So say we want to do pen tests because somebody's making us. It's part of, we have to be PCI compliant. A penetration test is required in PCI. It's non-negotiable, you have to do it. It's a cost of doing business. So do we want another report with a bunch of stuff we don't care about? I'd argue no. And one alternative to that is we can use DevOps culture and practices and apply that to our approach with offensive security testing. And again, it's creating cross-functional teams, but in this case for the purposes of testing our security. And I'd say this cross-functional team will be a little heavier on different security roles than, say, maybe a cross-functional product team in our companies. So in our purple team, we might have blue team folks. We might have systems engineers who know a lot about hardening operating systems, and almost certainly a really good red teamer or penetration tester. In addition to security roles, representing key roles in the organization, I often think of it as incident response first. When we have an incident, we're going to have a bunch of different roles come together across the organization, often executives, PR, customer support, maybe even HR. So a lot of our senior team members that aren't even technical. So in this purple team, it might be a little more technical where we have the security folks, we have a software engineer or a systems engineer, often a combination of those people, and hopefully people who are actively working in our organizations in these systems. And what we're going to do is test our environment, essentially perform a penetration test, but do so in a way that we can create a learning environment. So the blue team owns vulnerability scanning, and they'll do more than generate results and create tickets and some vulnerability management or patch management queue, creating a bunch of noise. They might validate that the result is an actual vulnerability right there. Because if we're creating tickets, we're still just wasting people's time. And the cool thing is, we're meeting our annual penetration test requirement too, so we have a business driver for it, and we can do a higher value exercise along the way. So we have the cross-functional team, we get it together and dedicate the time to it. A day or two exercise, conference room, bring in lunch, focus on it. And admittedly, the team's going to look different depending on your organization, right? The roles, maybe what executive roles are represented. I would say at least one non-technical stakeholder should be part of it. Maybe they don't hang out the whole time, but think of your incident response plan again. You probably have a stakeholder in there who's not super technical, but if you were responding to a breach, they'd be there the whole time. Consider engaging them. Because this too, if you were feeling really motivated, you could potentially do your incident response test as part of this as well. So make sure in your cross-functional team, and make sure you're representing ops, your development team. You definitely want your key technical team members in the team. The security team members, and you might have these security team members in your organization. Maybe you have a red team, maybe you don't. You can have people facilitate these exercises, but you do want your blue team or your security operations team, the folks who can represent what you have implemented in security in your organization in the team as well. And you'll come up with a bunch of real-world exercises and run through those exercises. One might even just be a phishing test, right? How boring is that? But think of all these ransomware tests we're doing in our organizations. I know that many manufacturing, healthcare, nonprofit, these industries are operating legacy technology architectures with flat networks. If you can run software on your network and encrypt a meaningful part of it, well, that's a big deal. So maybe that's an exercise. And if you're not in an organization where that's the case, well, you learn quickly. And then you can talk about it too, because I'll tell you what, I've been, even in the tech organizations I've been helping build, and we certainly didn't have flat networks. And our assets we cared about weren't on our workstations that we were doing day-to-day jobs on. So there was no attack vector. It just didn't matter. It wasn't a big deal. But I still had to talk about it all the time because, well, it's a thing that's affecting a lot of folks. So we have these different exercises using tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTP, because we have all this security jargon in our fields. And test our capabilities to detect and prevent. And what I'd emphasize, if we can, not all organizations can do this, but if you can, the way to get the most value out of this exercise is act on what you learn immediately. If you figure out you can't detect something, create a new alert in the SIM. Update your intrusion detection system. SIM is the central logging or event correlation tool. I try not to use jargon, but for more commonly used jargon, I can't help myself sometimes. I think we have a question in the audience. I see that question mark, very clever.
Thanks. So you're talking about building this purple team. You're talking about building the team within the organization, right? And conducting these exercises?
The question is, am I talking about building a permanent purple team in the organization or building it within a company?
Like within, yeah, like company A, these are company A employees that are testing or trying to identify company A's vulnerabilities. Is that what you're describing?
Potentially. I often think of it as a team that comes together and is spun down after the couple days or maybe a week is spent on this. Many tech organizations I've been in, we might have a week or a month where we're dedicated in the tech team to finding vulnerabilities and maybe code reviews or fixing vulnerabilities or doing pairing exercises focused on improving security. I've been in many organizations that do that. So I think of it as a time-limited thing. If your organization is big enough and you have enough resources, you could certainly build permanent purple teams. I'd say, well, cross-functional teams with shared goals, right? We're building product teams, we're building shared goals and purpose. We're not network teams, we're site reliability product teams. So maybe we have a purple team that's focused on improving the detection and response capabilities in our organization. But for most of us, I'd expect it to maybe be a temporary team we bring together. And not all of us are going to have people with all these capabilities in-house. In many cases, almost all cases, I'd expect us to bring in an external red teamer. I don't know many organizations that have full-time red teams.
That's kind of what I was asking is, you mentioned like for PCI compliance and all that stuff, and I think our team operates under the assumption that we can't have an effective, maybe like a red team strategy where...
External tester, somebody who's separate from the org. I mean, there's value in that, having the external view. And I often change vendor, even though I have go-to firms I like to work with because they hire and employ and keep the best folks. Every other or every 3 years, I might change things up just to have a fresh pair of eyes. The thing is, though, PCI doesn't require an external vendor. And I can't name a single compliance framework off the top of my head that requires external. But the external convention is super common. And you know, it makes sense, so it's kind of difficult to argue with. I guess we could probably conduct a study and see if there's actual value there. But so you could, with the purple team exercise, you could get that, say you need to have an external test. You could have a red teamer either conduct, facilitate, or be part of your purple team, and then you have that external view as well. But again, I'd strongly encourage, where you can, to iterate and implement changes as you find them. Not all of our companies can do this, but many technology organizations I work with can. And if it just ends up on a list somewhere, we have a ton of stuff to do. We don't need another list. Let's just do it when we're focused on it. So through purple team exercises, the cross-functional purple team, we're running TTPs and testing, and along the way, we're learning and implementing. And if we can't implement, we should at least document the lessons learned and make sure we act on those improvements later. Yes, sir?
So for teams that release every 2 weeks and that have a web presence and they're changing components to the web, how does this work? Like, you said you could have people embedded on the team, right?
You're talking about sprints, yes? Yeah. So how to fit it into a software development lifecycle. I wouldn't expect it to be, like I said, I typically expected a temporary team you bring together. So you might take folks out of different parts of your organization who are operating in sprints. So maybe you have your reduced points in your sprint team or scrum team or product team for that week, or maybe you say that for this sprint, we're going to allocate this team to this purpose, so when you pull folks out of it, it's not going to affect velocity in a way that doesn't have organizational buy-in. But I wouldn't really operate it in a sprint. I guess you could if you were really determined, like thinking through it, it could work, but you're adding process overhead, right? So what's the value there? And there can be a lot of value in agile practices, and ultimately this is path to agility. I'm not advocating against agile. I like agile. It's just, well, I wouldn't add overhead to this unless it's producing value, because the focus is the exercise, the collaboration, learning and implementing, hopefully in near real time.
Okay, so let me rephrase the question. So if I used to work for a healthcare company and that high trust was a big thing for us at that time, and then while we got to the point of high trust, we already had the application full swing, the users were using it, and then one of the customers actually wanted us to be high trust. So it was a little late in the game. But moving forward, what we were trying to do is try to implement most of those things as the product gets released every time. And we were on a 6-week cadence, so every 6 weeks there would be a release to production. So this would then be part of that 6-week cadence, right?
No, again, you're talking about SDLC, and you're talking about how the engineering team manages their work in a product team. We're talking about security operations here. You might find vulnerabilities in the product, and maybe you'd fix them. I was thinking more operationally in the examples I was providing.
But wouldn't you want to find it every time that you're releasing something? Or you do it only certain times?
We're talking purple team exercises. So you can implement automation in your SDLC, and if you find vulnerabilities, when it breaks the build, or you find vulnerabilities that need to be fixed, you're going to create issues cards, whatever your jargon is, and you're going to work it in your Agile process. Separate things. And we can talk more after the presentation if you'd like to explore DevSecOps more. But in this case, I'd expect the purple team exercise to operate outside of that. Now, maybe if you discover software vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities in your tech stack that wouldn't fit and just fix it right now and document the least you need to meet your processes and not break things, maybe you put it in a backlog and you work it later. So you have to align to how you work in an organization. I would not expect the purple team exercise to be operating directly in the SDLC. Whole environment, not just the product. So I've talked a lot about generalities here, and I want to point out there's a purple team exercise framework. It's published on GitHub, and if you internet search purple team exercise framework, you should find it. It's really good. It's a little more tactical than some of the things we've been talking today, but if you're looking to implement some of these things in your organization, it can act as an initial roadmap. So now what? We know how to build a security program, but consider the paradigm of how we're operating. Are we enabling our organizations, or are we holding it back? I don't care if you're CISO or security analyst, or really in any role. We should be helping move our organizations forward. Consider DevOps culture and practices. How can you embed security in your technology team with DevSecOps? Maybe you have operational cadences that are low value, such as annual penetration tests. How can you do them differently to provide value? If you're spending $15,000 to $60,000 a year on penetration tests, that's budget you've allocated and time you've allocated for this. Use it for something useful. If you're doing tactical exercises, reimagine them. Can you meet your penetration test requirements with the purple team exercise? Effectively, what we've been talking about the whole time is penetration testing, but we need to do a pen test. So make sure we kick out a report in the end, or do enough of the processes that would fall under a penetration test along the way. Maybe we have an annual technical training requirement for our engineering teams. I know many of the engineers I've worked with don't learn a whole lot by staring at slides with code blocks on them. But it's good, we do it anyway. I mean, learning's good, right? But maybe they can be part of this exercise and they're learning secure coding techniques as part of the work we're doing. These are all different ways we can take some of the things we're doing that are lower value, reimagine them in a way to meet the requirements, and do stuff that's actually worth doing. If you have a smaller team or lack skills in certain areas, consider bringing folks in from the outside. Application security folks who are experienced are a rare breed around the world. There's a very short list of folks. There's one person who I consider world-class in Columbus, and I work with them. I brought them into many organizations I've worked with and helped build. And they work on my team now, right? So don't think that if there's a gap that you can't find people to help. They're out there. In a quick detailed point too, just coming back to the tactical things we do, if we have vulnerability management programs and patch management programs, and I certainly hope we do, because pay attention to the things you have and take care of it. Well, patching is taking care of it. We often run scans, we create tickets, we have a list of all these high-risk things that really aren't put in the context of our organization. Half the time it's a false positive. Why isn't the person who's doing the scan validating the vulnerability before creating the ticket? We have proof of concept exploit code out there all over the place. If it's showing up in a vulnerability scan, it's almost guaranteed there's a proof of concept exploit out there that's readily available on PacketStorm or whatever the thing is people are using these days. If we're doing things that are creating work that's low value, how can we do it differently? Maybe we have to learn or grow in our roles along the way, and that's great for all of us. I'll leave, let's see here, we're at 45 minutes. I've been a little rambly today, so thank you for your patience. I was trying to use up a little more time while still talking about things that I hope you found useful. I tell you what, I know we're recording today, and if you ever watch a recorded presentation where there's a lot of rambling dialogue and you can only hear half of it, it kind of ruins the recording. So I'm going to wrap up the presentation so we can have a clean recording, and then we can just chat. We can talk more about DevSecOps and SDLC and any other conversations you want to have. I do like to close talking about the community work I do. Like I mentioned before, I founded a nonprofit tech community coalition 6 years ago. What we do is we support the tech and startup community through charity and education. We have over 50 active technology and startup groups here in Columbus that are nonprofit focused on helping us learn, focused on topics like security, like software, or groups like COHAA and Path to Agility. COHAA is among that 50 plus groups. TCC exists to support them. We just had our first annual Tech Community Summerfest on Saturday in McPherson Commons in the Arena District. Live music, it was a ton of fun. So if you're in the tech community and you're organizing and you're not a part of the things we're doing, I'd love to chat more about it. I founded and organized Labs of Columbus. We meet monthly. We just had our Sysadmin Day party. We have a meeting coming up later this month in August. Check out lopsacbus.org, LOPSACBus.org. OLF conference is going to return in December this year. We're going to be in person, probably hybrid again. OLFconference.org to learn more about that. We haven't technically announced the dates. At Gamma Force, we help companies with tech and cybersecurity strategy through fractional executive service and expert strike teams. If you need help with this, we might be able to help. If you don't need help with this, that's cool too, and we can hang out. And huge thanks to Path to Agility for having me. Like I said before, it's one of my favorite events in town. Organizing anything right now is more difficult than ever. The last event I organized operated at a loss. There's a good chance that if something is happening right now, It's more work, and it's losing money. And nonprofits don't have enough money in the first place. So please thank your organizers. Please support them any way you can. And I have stickers for all these things. So if you'd like some stickers, many of the things I have on my laptop, I'd be happy to share them with you. Thank you all. I appreciate you having me. So cool. Questions, conversations. What are we going to talk about?
So Warner, in our organization, we run a lot of automated tools. We talked about these ASTs that we run during code scans and that sort of thing that run during our build pipeline, right, our CI/CD process, that detect vulnerabilities and that sort of thing. So with that type of process, would that fall into kind of like, this purple team kind of concept?
I mean, you can use a bunch of different tools. I mean, an application security testing tool might be part of the purple team exercise, but think of it more like in the context of war game exercises, like the phishing example. Or maybe, I like this example a little more, but it's a little more technically complicated. So say you have a software as a service product that's accessible on the internet. And, well, what's an attack vector for a web app? Maybe there's a vulnerability where there's not output and input validation checking. So maybe the application's able to be escaped and then manipulate queries to the database. So a SQL injection attack, then that might be a way to exfiltrate. Or maybe it's, again, it's almost always input validation with a lot. That's why we have a WASP top 10. A lot of these vulnerabilities are still common. The attack vector is executing system level code on the operating system. So sure, this app server's in the DMZ, but once you're able to execute system level code, maybe there's a vulnerability like the Apache Spark vulnerability. What was that, Equifax? The vulnerability had been known for 90 days. That breach cost over $1 billion. Their insurance paid out like $100 million or something. I dug through the 10K, did a bit of a case study on it. Over $1 billion because they didn't patch their shit. Like, patch your shit. I have a buddy who's a CISO who has a sticker that says that. But yeah, to the point. So those were scenarios, right? And well, are you detecting those things? Because all of us are going to have vulnerabilities no matter what we do. Humans are fallible. Humans build the technology we use. Technology is fallible. So it's more about detecting and preventing, right? Maybe you do have input validation on your app, but it's all manually built. You're not using a module. So it's pretty good, but there's stuff that's probably going to get through. So we're using a web application firewall. Is the WAP preventing it? These are all different scenarios we build. So you might build different scenarios depending on your organization, what you do, what your capabilities are. But I think of it in the context of what do you do? How can you wrap an exercise around it that's focused on detection and prevention? And if you don't detect or prevent it, try and build detection and prevention capabilities right there in the moment.
So I do like the audit side, and every time our auditor comes back and says, well, you guys have these third-party library vulnerabilities. And so we have this tool, the OWASP dependency check, and it just comes up with a nice amount of vulnerabilities. So where do you draw the line between something like this? Because obviously it's helpful because it shows our vulnerabilities, but it's creating so much work. So like, where do you draw the line between value and just extra work?
I mean, some tools are worse than others. Just talking about noise and dependency checking and scans and stuff. I would argue that keeping our stuff up to date is good. If we're not really good at keeping our stuff up to date, figure out how to get better at it, because that's huge. Like, know what we have, pay attention to it. If we're not good at those things, we can't be good at the fancy things. So that said, well, what we'd be doing in a purple team exercise is we'd be putting context around it, right? We wouldn't be creating a ticket for someone else to roll their eyes at it later. We'd be doing that in the room. If you're not doing it in the room, the same stuff applies. The best vulnerability management program I ever built was the person working the process was responsible for not only finding the thing from the scan or whatever, but validating that it was real. If we have automated scanning tools in our development pipeline and they have high noise, we can't break the build over it because our build certainly can't do continuous delivery. So if our tools are that bad, they probably can't be used in certain parts of the environment. So I'm assuming manual process. No tool, unless you really customize it, is going to tell you what the risk is from a scan result. You need a human to do that. The auditor's not going to do that. So somebody needs to be able to wrap context around whatever a finding is. And more often than not, those findings don't matter. So we don't want to track them. We don't necessarily want to act on them. But we don't want that noise to keep on coming up too. So can we tune the tool? Or maybe the tool just sucks and we get rid of it.
How do you get away from tracking them?
Oh,
Okay.
no, you're fine. She's
Oh,
been
you're
waiting
good.
so patiently with the So, I just wanted to know the frequency you create purple teams in an organization, and if you wait till there's a trigger of an incident or an automated tool.
I wouldn't do it at all from an incident. I mean, at that point, it's an incident response team. You might test your incident. I was just trying to provide examples of how we might think creatively within the things we do to test our capabilities and meet the administrative requirements of our security programs. Incident response tests are good, but maybe we could do it then and reduce some of our work. Frequency. This is ultimately an exercise that's designed to test our capabilities. Frequency is up to you. How often do we do a DR test, right? Google, I saw this director of a disaster recovery present years ago, this lady, senior manager at Google, and she was telling this story about how the early days of the DR at Google, and she basically built it, she went into this VP's office and she's like, I want to unplug a data center. And he just smirked at her and he said, do it. and it caused a really big outage, right? And it was one that many of us knew at the time. I forget all the details. It was a while ago. But they kept on doing that. They kept on doing that. And they got better as a result. And their platform's highly available and incredibly resilient. So when data centers get unplugged now, well, it doesn't take out a significant part of their environment. The same philosophy can apply here. Do we want to do it 5 times a year? Do we want to do it 20 times a year? I'd say at least once, right? That's kind of our default cadence for a lot of these activities. I'm just burning time, Faye, on Q&A. Do I need to wrap up? Oh, cool. Welcome. Great audience. We're having a fantastic conversation. At least once a year.
So I have a question, a real question. Have you found yourself in a position where maybe you have a third-party company that does your pen testing on your websites and whatnot? Great, mostly scanning, right, for the majority, versus maybe bringing in an ethical hacker who can kind of look at maybe the MITRE attack framework and find their way around and whatnot? How do you explain the difference between those two approaches to people who maybe aren't in the technical space?
Call it a tool in a skin versus experienced professional who has years, if not decades, of experience breaking into complex systems. Yeah, it's just, I mean, that communicates really well. Everyone knows a lot of tools aren't great, right? I don't think it has to be super sophisticated. Now, are you talking about creating a business justification for hiring a FTE who is?
Curious if you've ever found yourself in that position and had to work your way through that red tape a little bit.
Yeah, frankly, I usually don't hire red team folks in the teams I build because it's a much higher maturity thing. And there are always a ton of things we can do before getting there. And it's highly competitive. The folks doing that work like to do that work. They're commonly very decided, and that's the work they want to do. So you can hire them, but if there's not enough work, they're not going to be super into it. Like, they don't want to do blue team work. So if you have a really big company, a more mature security program, and enough things in your environment to set them loose, and the leadership to empower them and set context in a way that makes their effort effective, go for it. But usually a really easy business justification is if you spend a six-figure sum on pen tests every year. And big organizations can. I'd say many organizations are in the 15 to 50, but if you have hundreds of apps or thousands of employees, if you're paying a six-figure sum for your testing on an annualized basis, it's a pretty easy dollars and cents business justification to bring it in-house. And typically, you're going to get higher value results from in-house activities.
Slightly different question on security. Do you recommend any trainings for product owners so they develop more secure products to begin with, like from the thinking process? To give you an example, I was working on a product where the product owner really wanted to have this functionality where you put in the username and whatever password you put in, if the user doesn't exist in the system, it will tell the person that the user doesn't exist in the system, like you're not in the system. And we were trying to convince her that is not a very good idea, because now you're telling the person that this email or whatever your user ID is not in the system, right? So you're getting them one step closer to a hack by doing that. But are there any trainings you would recommend for product owners and people who are not very technical to start on this path of bringing security as much left in the process as possible?
I don't know any product owner specific training. If any of you know, do any of you know of good product owner specific training? I'm seeing a lot of head shaking. No. Pardon me?
Would something like purple belt,
Yeah, like a purple belt training.
yeah, would that apply, or like
Maybe.
the trainings leading up to that?
Yeah, it might exist. I can't name it. If you actively sought it out, frankly, I'm sure it exists, but is it good? I'm thinking good. I usually, for stuff like that, I usually like to do it myself. So if I were the CISO, I'd want to do it internally. Or I'd find someone to hire whom I knew would be capable of it, and I'd provide the direction. I wouldn't expect the average product owner to have much more security knowledge than the average experienced corporate or business professional, which honestly should be decently high on average these days, because we've been doing annual security testing in many of our organizations for years now. Some better than others. I usually like to go bespoke if I'm going to create a culture of security and build true awareness in the organization. Because as much as we need to know what we have and pay attention to it, security is everyone's responsibility, and we're never going to be secure. So if we don't have awareness in people who are paying attention in the context of their role, we are going to be less secure as an organization. I do that sooner in most companies. There's some things I do much later, like hire a offensive hacker or offensive tester. There are things I do much sooner. Access control and awareness training I do in most organizations. But in organizations that don't have the compliance requirement, I'll be less mechanical about it. The priority will be building knowledge and awareness. So coming back to the product thing, I do a similar thing, but in the context of product. A message I've been sharing in security audiences, especially CISO circles, is, we have a big leadership gap in the profession right now, where we have a lot of folks with executive titles who are very tactical, and they know how to build security operations capabilities tactically, but do they know how to manage risk or put it in the context of the business of the organization to actually create business value? Almost certainly not. And then, if we're a technology company, cloud native, operating in a modern fashion, security operations matters less. Because my cloud native companies don't have a bunch of stuff in an internal network. And we can control the stuff we want to protect the most in much more sophisticated ways with technical controls. Cloud native tooling is great. GuardDuty and AWS is awesome. Having full visibility in a single stack reduces some of the technical complexity when we own all the physical infrastructure. So capabilities are really high. And then I think I have 5 minutes, just checking time. The security operations is important, but the thing the tactical CISO starts to do just doesn't matter that much. Do you have endpoint protection? Do you have DLP? What about your CASB? They're going down a vendor checkbox, right? And most of that stuff isn't managing risk in an org like that. What does matter, though, is product security. Are you protecting the stuff you want to protect the most in the production environment? And are you thinking about security in the context of your product, the thing you're building? And most CISOs can't do that. We're starting to talk about it more. We're building awareness in the profession, but it's still a pretty rare skill set. And honestly, I'd want the CISO and the executive leader in the organization to be advocating for it. I would want that person to be helping the product organization. Sure, we don't want to disclose whether or not a user exists. And sure, that's not a great user experience if you put on the product hat. It's unfortunate that you had to burn time arguing that. It's pretty commonly accepted. You can point to things like NIST updated the password policy guidance to be much more modern, like 3 or 4 years ago. I used to write modern password policies, then I'd have to argue about them because people would say, it's not the thing we do all the time. Well, NIST updated the guidelines and they're finally sensible. They're great. I like the newer version a lot. Maybe you can point to external resources if a product manager is extra stubborn, but I'd want executive leadership to be driving that in the organization. In the back?
Yeah, for people who are technical or non-technical, they're interested in learning more about application security, like on QA automation, so I don't have that much of a purview, but do you have any resources you'd recommend?
OWASP. It's incredible. The Open Web Application Project, OWASP.org. ton of resources. It's lots of open source tech. There's I think it's called Security Shepherd. So we were talking about earlier that I don't like putting engineers through boring training with code blocks on slides. It's better than generic training, but still, it's not very effective. Don't quote me on this. I think it's Security Shepherd. WASP has a bunch of tools, and sometimes I confuse them. But they have a tool. It's open source. It's on their thing. And it's essentially like wargaming vulnerabilities. So you can spin up this web app that has a ton of vulnerabilities, and it's gamified. So you can go through and test, try and compromise them. And you get higher scores if you compromise it. So getting something that in place for an engineering team to help them learn is so much more valuable than just staring at code blocks and slides. So tools like that are just incredible, and OWASP has a ton of stuff on it. So I'd start there, specifically as it relates to app security.
So kind of piggybacking on his question, specifically for a CISO, what certifications or training do you think is absolutely so important they should 100% have it?
The challenge with the CISO role is that it's very broad, and it can get very deep technically across multiple disciplines, and most people just won't be capable of that. They might be good at parts of it. I think the number one thing is understanding risk management and aligning to the organization. How I build a security program, first thing I do is I understand what the company's doing. What are you doing as a company? What is creating value? What's generating revenue? What data and assets do you have? What threats do you have? And then I create a risk-based security program. But the priority is the business driver. So a common business driver is compliance, but that's a lower value technical business driver. So manage that in a way so it's not the tail wagging the dog, and not everyone does that. They like to apply it as a black and white thing, and it doesn't have to be, because it can reduce the capability of an organization. The more common and more real business driver I see more now is vendor risk management. If you're B2B, industry expectations. But again, build the capabilities to manage risk and create value in the organization, just not go down the list. If you look externally, you'll end up doing a bunch of stuff that administratively slows down an organization and doesn't add a lot of value, but adds a lot of overhead and expense. And that's the opposite of creating business value. So, and notice I wasn't talking about anything tactical. I'd say if a CISO can't take that strategic view, that's a significant gap, and they're probably not qualified for the role. I'm more critical about that these days because I see what they're doing to companies. And it's great that we have a seat at the table. It's great that more CISOs are reporting into CEOs. It's great that more CISOs are reporting into boards. That is what will manage risk and reduce all the security issues we're having across our nation. If we're just talking about endpoint protection, with that seat at the table, we're not going to continue to have that seat. So very tactically, to answer your question, I worked with a first-time CISO. I helped build the security program, experienced a technical manager, knew nothing about security. Great person. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done it because, I mean, there's a lot of work to do. I could have done anything I wanted. But it was a fun thing I did for about 6-12 months. And really big company, slow to act. Once we had the strategy in place, I'm like, this is going to take 3 to 5 years. We know what we have to do. Good luck. Let me know if you need anything. And well, but what I recommended to that gentleman was specifically going through the CISSP training that the ISSA, Central Ohio ISSA has. I just saw notices go out for the fall session. It'd been tricky with the pandemic. Great program, very inexpensive, especially if you're an ISSA member. I think it's $500 if you're not. It's, I want to say 8 sessions, 1 session for every domain in CISSP. But CISSP is super broad and kind of shallow, but if you look at the big book, it's a textbook, one of the driest books you'll ever read, it covers security very comprehensively. And no one, including myself, is going to be an expert in all those things, but having awareness of it is valuable. And I encouraged him to go through that to get a broader perspective. The EC Council certified CISO is decent. I'm not sure I'd advocate going out of the way, but it's decent. But really, CISSP, just because it'll force learning that would be difficult to have otherwise. It's difficult to step into the role without experience and knowledge and so on. I think I'm at time. Is the next speaker in the room? Excellent. So I'll quit rambling. I'll be around for most of the day, and I'm always happy to chat about these things. Like I said, I have stickers if you'd like them. Which stickers would you like?